Chapters 10 and 11 focus on the three main goals in macroeconomics. They focus on gross domestic product or growth, output, jobs measured by the unemployment rate, and prices, aggregate prices as measured by the unemployment rate. So these two chapters are covering the key fundamentals of how to measure the health of an economy. Think of it in terms of if we're looking at key health measures for the human body, things like blood pressure, cholesterol levels, pulse rate, different things, measure the health of the body. The key measures of the health of an economy are going to be output, gross domestic product, jobs measured by the unemployment rate, and aggregate prices as measured by the inflation rate. So first, what is gross domestic product? Well, gross domestic product is simply just the total value of all goods and services produced in an economy during a certain time frame, typically a year. Now, we're going to exclude from that intermediate purchases. We're going to exclude from that secondary purchases. Only new products and services that are produced are going to be included in the total value of GDP. GDP is actually measured quarterly, so in terms of quarterly measures, there's 4 quarters in the year, 3 months each, and every quarter the National Bureau of Economic Research presents its findings, and we get the growth rate for every quarter, and then you can also aggregate that into a larger yearly growth rate. Current U.S. GDP stands at right at $17 trillion. So you can think of it this way, that total income in the United States, if you were going to compare the country to a household, is right at $17 trillion. That's the total value of all goods and services that we produce yearly within the United States of America. Now, quarterly rates help us determine what's the growth rate quarter to quarter. And what we typically like to see in an economy is we like to see quarterly growth rates somewhere in the 3 to 4% range per year. Positive, of course, we want the economy to grow. If growth rates are lower than, say, 3%, down in the 2s or 1s, then we tend to think the economy is growing slower than it typically should. If growth rates ever turn negative, then the economy actually begins to shrink during that time frame, and a very loose definition of a recession typically is 6 months of continuous declining GDP growth. There's some other measures that go into defining a recession, but that's sort of the loose measure. So a healthy economy, we want to see roughly 3 to 4% growth per quarter. Now, our 2 most recent quarters conducted in the U.S. would be the first quarter of 2014, going from January through March. We actually recorded a negative 2.6% growth rate, which means the economy actually shrank in the first quarter of the year, which is a real negative sign, a telling sign about the health of the economy. Now, if that had continued into the second quarter, we very likely would have been in a recession. But sometimes you get these single quarters to be isolated blips, and luckily that's what happened in this case, because in the second quarter of 2014, which was April through June, the economy actually turned around and grew by 4.9%. So we had a very, very stronger than we would expect, growth rate in the second quarter. Now, you can also put those together and see that in total, in aggregate, over the past 6 months, the first 6 months of the year, we had a very modest growth rate in the 2% range, 2.5% range. So GDP, or growth or output, is very important to the overall health of the economy. Several things in Chapter 10 talk about growth. We can also mention nominal GDP is a current year measure of output. We typically talk more about real GDP, which is an inflation-adjusted measure of output. We always want to focus on real GDP, and the numbers I've been quoting are real GDP rather than nominal GDP. You can also, in Chapter 10, you'll see that there's some good sections on what determines growth rates, some good things about discussions about government and their role that they play, what degree of growth is desirable, and so forth. Now, once we get into Chapter 11, Chapter 11 connects the two final key goals of any economy together, where they talk about unemployment and inflation. So growth is absolutely tied closely to the unemployment rate. Higher growth is going to mean more jobs, which means the unemployment rate should slowly get pushed downward. Lower growth or a recession should imply, and does imply, fewer jobs or even losing jobs in times of recessions, and the unemployment rate should go up. This is very much related to what Chapter 11 talks about as the business cycle, the natural cyclical pattern that we tend to see within any economy. When there tends to be growth in an economy, unemployment falls. That's going to continue for a time, and then growth is going to decline for a time, which is the recession, which unemployment is going to go up. And then that fall, that recession will bottom out, and the economy will begin to grow again, and we'll add jobs. And there's a cyclical pattern, as the book talks about, typically 4 phases of a business cycle: peak, recession, expansion. Peak, recession, there's a trough down there, expansion, and then back to the next peak. If you go back and look at the Great Recession, which we refer to as the unusually severe recession that occurred in 2008 into 2009, the NBER has been able to date that recession as beginning in December of 2007, lasting all the way until June of 2009, about 16-month recession. And what we witnessed there was a real GDP growth rate over those 16 months declined about 5-6% in total, which is fairly significant. And the unemployment rate went from the mid 5% range all the way up to a peak of 10.2% range. We've been growing, the economy has been growing since the summer of 2009, and unemployment rate has been able to slowly move downward. Today, which is the September 2014 unemployment figures, we're nationally at 5.9%. If you think about the overall health in terms of employment, what do we want to see in terms of the unemployment rate? Just as we want to see 3 to 4% growth rate in GDP, we would really like to see unemployment rate be perhaps somewhere between 4 and 5%, which is sometimes referred to as the full employment level. Ironically, we don't expect to see zero unemployment, or frankly, and oftentimes don't want to see zero unemployment. We want to push unemployment down to the level where everybody that wants a job has a job, but there's going to be lots of people out there who are migrating between jobs or perhaps gaining new skills to get another job who are going to be unemployment for a limited time, and we expect that to happen. My own personal bias, I think the full employment rate, sometimes called the natural rate of unemployment, is probably somewhat closer to 4, while other instructors and economists may think that number perhaps is closer to 5 or even 5.5%. You can see the difference there. If we're currently at 5.9, if one believes that the full employment level is at 5.5, well, then we're practically there, and another 0.4 of a drop in unemployment, we could say that we are at the maximum capacity of the economy in terms of employment. I don't really see that as being realistic. I would think that the full employment level would be at the minimum in the 4% range, and probably closer to 4% than 5%. But there's going to be different subjective normative biases. when you look at these things. It also talks in chapter 11 a little bit about ways to measure unemployment. The formula is important for measuring the unemployment rate, and also some key types of unemployment that exist in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, structural and cyclical unemployment, or unemployment that exists that we expect, that we're not too worried about. That's frictional and structural unemployment we would not be too worried about. Cyclical unemployment, on the other hand, is unemployment caused due to a lack of aggregate demand or due to a recession. And we're very concerned about cyclical unemployment. And in fact, today, as we're trying to push the unemployment rate downward, what we're trying to get rid of is cyclical unemployment caused by weakness in the overall economy, or the lack of strong growth that's been occurring the last couple of years. Although 4.9% growth is extremely strong, and if we can maintain that growth rate, it'll take only just a very few months for the unemployment rate to go down into the 4% range if we can maintain a growth rate of 4.5–5%. The last thing the chapter talks about is a little bit on inflation, aggregate prices. It talks about the inflation rate, how we calculate it. And remember, inflation is not the rising of a single good or service. It's the rising of prices of the aggregate of goods and services across the country, whereas deflation would be the general drop in the aggregate price level across the country. Now, there's a lot to be said in the country today about the national debate we're having about the potential of rapid inflation on the horizon, or, as some would argue, even deflation on the horizon, and about which one's of bigger concern. That's been at the forefront of the debate over how to grow the economy in the last few years. But be sure you can calculate the inflation rate. Also, inflation is very closely tied to income, both nominal and real income. Typically, in a healthy economy, we want to see the inflation rate to be about 2%. That's the Federal Reserve's targeted goal of inflation, is 2%, which is sort of ironic. We also don't want inflation to be zero. It's okay as long as inflation is rising at a low, consistent pace. The argument is then jobs will pick up, growth will pick up, wages will pick up, and the economy will continue to do better. And then there's also, lastly, a few paragraphs about how the inflation rate's related to the interest rate in terms of real and nominal interest rates. So give that a look. So chapters 10 and 11 are really good chapters. They're core chapters to understand macroeconomics, talking about growth, unemployment, and the price level. And the key ways we measure those is through gross domestic product measure, unemployment rate, and the inflation rate. And now we have some idea of what we'd like to see in terms of a healthy economy. 3 to 4% GDP growth is ideal. 4 to 5% unemployment rate is ideal, and about 2% inflation is ideal. And if we can achieve those economic indicators, then it's a safe bet that the national economy is doing very well and moving in the right direction. Thanks.